public opinion was unanimous as to the importance of the great traveler's exploration, and keenly appreciative of the courage, skill, and honesty exhibited by him. A short time later, the English government offered Mungo Park the conduct of an expedition to the interior of Australia, but he refused it. In 1804, however, the African Society determined to complete the survey of the Niger and proposed to Mungo Park the command of a new expedition for its exploration. This time the great traveler did not refuse, and upon the 30th of January, 1805, he left England. 2 months later he landed at Goree. He was accompanied by his brother-in-law, Anderson, a surgeon, by George Scott, a draftsman, and by 35 artillerymen. He was authorized to enroll as many soldiers as he liked in his service, and was provided with a credit of £500. These resources, says Walkner, so vast in comparison with those furnished by the African Society, were, to our thinking, partly the cause of his loss. The rapacious demands of the African kings grew in proportion to the riches they supposed our traveler to possess, and the effort to meet the enormous drain made upon him was in great part the cause of the catastrophe which brought the expedition to an end. 4 carpenters, 1 officer, and 35 artillerymen, and a Mandingo merchant named Isaac, who was to act as guide, with the leaders of the expedition already mentioned, composed an imposing caravan. Mungo Park left Kei upon the 27th of April, 1805, and reached Pisania the next day. From this place, 10 years earlier, he had started upon his first exploration. Taking an easterly direction, he followed his former route as far as Bambaku, upon the shores of the Niger. When he arrived at this place, the number of Europeans was already reduced to 6 soldiers and a carpenter. The remainder had succumbed to fatigue or the fevers incidental to the inundations. The exactions of the various petty chiefs through whose domains the expedition passed had considerably diminished the stock of merchandise. Mungo Park was now guilty of an act of grave imprudence, remarking that trade was very active at Sandsending, a town containing 11,000 inhabitants, and that beads, indigo, antimony, rings, bracelets, and other articles not likely to be spoiled in the transit to England were freely exhibited for sale. He opened, says Walkner, a large shop which he stocked with European merchandise for sale wholesale and retail, and probably the large profits he made excited the envy of the merchants. The natives of Jenne, the Moors, and merchants of Sandsending, joined with those of Sego in offering, in the presence of Modibin, to give the king of Mansong a larger and more valuable quantity of merchandise than he had received from the English traveler if he would seize his baggage and then kill him or send him out of Bambara. But in spite of his knowledge of this fact, Mungo Park still kept his shop open, and he received, as the proceeds of one single day's business, 25,756 pieces of money, or carries. Upon the 28th of October, Anderson expired, after 4 months' illness, and Mungo Park found himself once more alone in the heart of Africa. The king of Mansong had accorded him permission to build a boat, which would enable him to explore the Niger. Naming his craft the Jaliba, he fixed upon the 16th of November for his departure. Here his journal ends, with details on the riverside populations, and on the geography of the countries he was the first to discover. This journal, when it reached Europe, was published, imperfect as it was, as soon as the sad fact was realized that the writer had perished in the waters of the Jaliba. It contained in reality no new discovery, but it was recognized as useful to geographical science. Mungo Park had determined the astronomical position of the more important towns, and thereby furnished material for a map of Senegambia. The perfecting of this map was entrusted to Arrowsmith, who stated in an advertisement that, finding wide differences between the positions of the towns as shown in the journal by each day's travel, and that furnished by the astronomical observations, it was impossible to reconcile them. But that, in accordance with the latter, he had been obliged to place the route followed by Mungo Park in his first voyage farther north. It was reserved for the Frenchman Walkner to discover a curious discrepancy in Mungo Park's journal. This was a singular error upon the part of the traveler, which neither the English editor nor the French translator, whose work was badly performed, had discovered. Mungo Park in his diary records events as happening upon the 31st of April. As everyone knows that that month has only 30 days, it followed that during the course of his journey the traveler had made a mistake of a whole day, reckoning in his calculations from the evening instead of the morning. Hence important rectifications were necessary in Arrowsmith's map. But nonetheless, when once Mungo Park's error is recognized, it is evident that to him we owe the first faithful map of Senegambia. Although the facts that reached the English government allowed no room for doubt as to the fate of the traveler, a rumor that white men had been seen in the interior of Africa induced the governor of Senegal to fit out an expedition. The command was entrusted to the Negro merchant Isaac, Mungo Park's guide, who had faithfully delivered the traveler's journal to the English authorities. We need not linger over the account of this expedition, but merely relate that which concerns the last days of Mungo Park. At Sandsending, Isaac encountered Amadi Fatama, the native who was with Park on the Jaliba when he perished, and from him he obtained the following recital. We embarked at Sandsending, and in 2 days reached Silla, the spot where Mungo Park completed his first journey. After 2 days' navigation, we reached Jenne. In passing Dibi, 3 boats, filled with Negroes armed with lances and arrows, but without firearms, approached us. We had passed successively Rakbara and Timbuktu, when we were pursued by these boats, which we repulsed with difficulty, and only after killing several natives. At Gurama we were attacked by 7 boats but succeeded in repulsing them. Constant skirmishes ensued, with heavy loss to the blacks, until we reached Kafo, where we remained for a day. We then proceeded down the river as far as Karmas and anchored off Gurnu. Next day we perceived a Moorish detachment, who allowed us to pass. We then entered the country of Hausa. Next day we reached Yayuri and sent Amadi Fatama into the town, with presents for the chief and to purchase food. The Negro, before accepting the presents, inquired if the white traveler intended to revisit his country. Mungo Park, to whom the question was reported, replied that he should never return. It is supposed that these words brought about his death. The Negro chief, once convinced that he should not see Mungo Park again, determined to keep the presents intended for his king. Meantime, Amadi Fatama reached the king's residence at some distance from the river. The prince, warned of the presence of the white men, sent an army next day to the small village of Bausa, on the river side. When the Jaliba appeared, it was assailed by a shower of stones and arrows. Park threw his baggage into the river and jumped in with his companions. All perished. Thus miserably died the first Englishman who had navigated the Jaliba and visited Timbuktu. Many efforts were made in the same direction, but almost all were destined to fail. At the end of the 18th century, 2 of Lin O's best pupils explored the south of Africa in the interests of natural history. Spamman undertook to search for animals, and Thunberg for plants. The account of Spamman's expedition, which, as we have said, was interrupted by his voyage in Oceania after Cook's expedition, was the first to appear. It was translated into French by Letourneur. In his preface, which is still allowed to stand, Letourneur deplored the loss of the learned explorer, who he said had died during a voyage to the Gold Coast. Just as the work was published, Spamman reappeared to the great astonishment of Letourneur. Spamman had reached Africa upon the 30th of April, 1772, and landed at the Cape of Good Hope. At this time the town was only 2 miles across each way, including the gardens and plantations adjoining it on one side. The streets were wide, planted with oaks, and the houses were white, or, to Spamman's surprise, painted green. His object in visiting the Cape was to act as tutor to the children of a M. Kirst, but upon his arrival in Cape Town, he found that his employer was absent at his winter residence in False Bay. When the spring came round, Spamman accompanied Kirst to Alphen, a property which he possessed near Constance. The naturalist availed himself of the opportunity to make many excursions in the neighborhood and attempt the somewhat dangerous ascent of the Table Mountain. By these means, he became acquainted with the manners and customs of the Boers and their treatment of their slaves. The violence of the latter was so great that the inhabitants of the town were obliged to sleep with locked doors and provided with firearms close at hand. Nearly all over the colony, a rough hospitality ensured a certain welcome for the traveler. Spamman relates several curious experiences of his own. I arrived one evening, he says, at the dwelling of a farmer named Van der Spuy, a widower born in Africa and father of the proprietor of the Red Constance or the Old Constance. Making believe not to see me approach, he remained stationary in the entry of his house. As I approached him, he offered his hand, still without attempting to come forward, and said, "Good day, you are welcome. How are you? Who are you? A glass of wine perhaps, or a pipe? Will you partake of something?" I answered his questions laconically and accepted his offers in the same style as they were offered. His daughter, a well-made girl of some 14 or 15 years of age, brought in dinner, which consisted of a fine breast of lamb, stewed with carrots. The meal over, she offered me tea so pleasantly that I was quite puzzled whether to admire the dinner or my charming hostess the most. Both father and daughter showed the greatest kindness and goodwill. I spoke to my host several times in hopes of breaking his silence, but his replies were brief, and I observed that he only once commenced a conversation himself when he pressed me to remain overnight in his house. I bid him farewell, deeply impressed with his hospitality. Spamman undertook several similar expeditions, among others, one to Hout Bay and Parle, in which he had frequent occasion to notice the exaggerations to be met with in the narrative of Kolb, his predecessor. He intended to continue his explorations during the winter and projected a journey into the interior when the fine season should return. When the frigates commanded by Captain Cook, the Resolution and Adventure, arrived at the Cape, Forster invited the young Swedish naturalist to accompany him, and Spamman was thus enabled to visit New Zealand, Van Diemen's Land, New Holland, Otaheite, Tierra del Fuego, the Antarctic regions, and New Georgia before his return to the Cape, where he landed on the 22nd of March, 1775. His first care upon his return was to organize his expedition to the interior, and in order to add to his available resources, he practiced medicine and surgery during the winter. A cargo of corn, medicine, knives, tinderboxes, and spirits for the preservation of specimens was collected and packed in an immense wagon, drawn by 5 yoke of oxen. Spamman says, "The conductor of this cart needs dexterity, not only in his management of the animals, but in the use of the whip of African drivers. These instruments are about 15 feet long, with a thong of the same or greater length, and a tongue of white leather almost 3 feet long. The driver holds this formidable instrument in both hands, and from his seat in front of the wagon can reach the foremost oxen with it. He distributes his cuts unceasingly, well understanding how and where to distribute them in such a manner that the hide of the animals feels the whip." Spamman was to accompany the wagon on horseback, and was accompanied by a young colonist, named Melman, who wished to penetrate into the interior for recreation. They started upon the 25th of July, 1775. After passing Rent River, scaling the Hottentot Holland Kloof, and crossing the Pomite, they entered a desert country, interspersed with plains, mountains, and valleys without water, but frequented by antelopes of various kinds, with zebras and ostriches. Spamman soon reached the warm mineral baths at the foot of the Zwartberg, which, at that time, were much frequented, the company having built a house near the mountains. At this point, the explorer was joined by young Amelman, and together they started for Zwellendam, which they reached upon the 2nd of September. We will give a few of the facts they collected about the inhabitants. The Hottentots are as tall as Europeans, their hands and feet are small, and their color a brownish yellow. They have not the thick lips of the Kaffirs and natives of Mozambique. Their hair is black and woolly, curly but not thick. They rub the entire body with fat and soot. A Hottentot who paints himself looks less naked, and more complete, so to say, than one who only rubs himself with grease. Hence the saying, a Hottentot without paint is like a shoe without blacking. O Hottentot. O Hottentot. Facsimile of early engraving. These natives usually wear a cloak called karos, made of sheep's skin, with the wool turned inwards. The women arrange it with a long point which forms a sort of hood, in which they place their children. Both men and women wear leather rings upon their arms and legs, a custom which gave rise to the fable that this race rolled puddings round their limbs, to feed on from time to time. They also wear copper and iron rings, but these ornaments are less common. The kraal, or Hottentot village, is a collection of huts in a circle, all very similar, and of the shape of beehives. The doors, which are in the center, are so low that they can only be entered on the knees. The hearth is in the middle of the hut, and the roof has no hole for the escape of the smoke. The Hottentots must not be confounded with the Bushmen. The latter live only for hunting and robbery. Their skill in throwing poisoned arrows, their courage, and the wildness of their lives render them invincible. At Zwellendam, Spamman saw the quagga, a species of horse like a zebra in shape but with shorter ears. The explorer next visited Mossel Bay, a harbor little used, as it is too much exposed to the west winds, and thence he proceeded to the country of the Houtniquas, or, as Burchell's map calls them, the Antiniquas. This woody country appeared fertile, and the colonists established there are prosperous. Spamman met with most of the quadrupeds of Africa in this district, such as elephants, leopards, lions, tiger cats, hyenas, monkeys, hares, antelopes, and gazelles. We will not attempt to follow Spamman to all the small settlements he visited. An enumeration of the streams, kraals, or villages he passed would convey no information to the reader. Rather, let us gather from his narratives a few curious and novel details concerning 2 creatures which he describes, the sheep of the Cape and the honey guide. When a sheep is to be killed, he says, the very leanest of the flock is selected. It would be impossible to use the others for food. Their tails are of a triangular shape and are often a foot and a half long and occasionally 6 inches thick in the upper part. One of these tails will weigh 8 or 12 pounds, and they consist principally of delicate fat, which some persons eat with bread instead of butter. It is used in the preparation of food and sometimes to make candles. After describing the two-horned rhinoceros, hitherto unknown, the new, an animal informs something between the horse and the ox, the gazelle, the baboon, and the hippopotamus, the habits of which were previously imperfectly known. Spamman describes a curious bird, of great service to the natives, which he calls the honey guide. This bird, he says, is remarkable neither in size nor color. At first sight it would be taken for a common sparrow, but it is a little larger than that bird, of a somewhat lighter color, with a small yellow spot on each shoulder and dashes of white in the wings and tail. In its own interests, this bird leads the natives to the bees' nests, for it is very fond of honey, and it knows that whenever a nest is destroyed, a little honey will be spilled or left behind as a recompense for its services. It seems to grow hungry in the morning and evening. In any case, it is then that it leaves its nest, and by its piercing cries attracts the attention of the Hottentots or the colonists. The cries are almost always answered by the appearance of natives or settlers, when the bird, repeating its call unceasingly, slowly flies from place to place towards the spot where the bees have made their home. Arrived at the nest, whether it be in the cleft of a rock, in a hollow tree, or in some underground cavity, the guide hovers about it for a few seconds, and then perches hard by, and remains a silent and hidden spectator of the pillage, in which he hopes subsequently to have his share. Of this phenomenon I have myself twice been a witness. A Bosjamin. A Bosjamin. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 12th of April, 1776, on his way back to the Cape, Spamman heard that a large lake, the only one in the colony, had been discovered to the north of the Schneeberg district. A little later, the traveler got back to the Cape and embarked for Europe with the numerous natural history collections he had made. About the same time, between 1770 to 1775, Thunberg, the Swede, whom Spamman had met at the Cape, made 3 successive journeys in the interior of Africa. They were not, any more than Spamman's, actual journeys of discovery, and we owe the acquisition of no new geographical fact to Thunberg. He did but make a vast number of interesting observations on the birds of the Cape, and he also ascertained a few interesting details respecting the various races of the interior, which turned out to be far more fertile than was at first supposed. Thunberg was followed in the same latitudes by an English officer, Lieutenant William Patterson, whose chief aim was to collect plants and other objects of natural history. He penetrated a little further north than the Orange River, and into Kaffraria a good deal further east than Fish River. To him, we owe the first notice of the giraffe, and his narrative is rich in important observations on the natural history, structure, and inhabitants of the country. It is a curious fact that the Europeans attracted to South Africa by zeal for geographical discovery were far less numerous than those whose motive was love of natural history. We have already mentioned Spamman, Thunberg, and Patterson. To this list, we must now add the name of the ornithologist Le Vaillant. Born at Paramaribo in Dutch Guiana, of French parents who traded in birds, Le Vaillant visited Europe with them as a mere child, and traversed Holland, Germany, Lorraine, and the Vosges on his way to Paris. It will readily be understood that this wandering life awoke in him a taste for traveling, and his passion for birds, early excited by the examination of private and public collections, made him eager to enrich science by descriptions and drawings of unknown species. Now what country would afford the richest ornithological harvest? The districts near the Cape had been explored by botanists and by a scientific man who had made quadrupeds his chief study, but no one had as yet traversed them to collect birds. Le Vaillant arrived at the Cape on the 29th of March, 1781, after the loss of his vessel in an explosion, with nothing but the clothes he wore, 10 ducats, and his gun. Others would have been disheartened, but Le Vaillant did not despair of extricating himself from his painful position. Confident in his skill with the gun and the bow, in his strength and agility, as well as in his skill in preparing the skins of animals, and in stuffing birds so that their plumage should retain all its original gloss, the naturalist had soon opened relations with the wealthiest collectors of the Cape. One of these, an official named Bors, provided Le Vaillant with every requisite for a successful journey, including carts, oxen, provisions, objects for barter, and horses. Even servants and guides were appointed, free of cost, to the explorer. The kind of researches to which Le Vaillant intended to devote himself influenced his mode of traveling. Instead of seeking frequented and beaten tracks, he tried to avoid them, and to penetrate into districts neglected by Europeans, hoping in them to meet with birds unknown to science. As a result, he may be said always to have taken nature by surprise, coming into contact with natives whose manners had not yet been modified by intercourse with whites. So that the information he gives us brings savage life, as it really is, more vividly before us than anything told us by his predecessors or successors. The only mistake made by Le Vaillant was the entrusting of the translation of his notes to a young man who modified them to suit his own notions. Far from taking the scrupulous care to be exact which distinguishes modern editors, he exaggerated facts. And, dwelling too much on the personal qualities of the traveler, he gave to the narrative of the journey a boastful tone, very prejudicial to it. After 3 months' stay at the Cape and in its neighborhood, Le Vaillant started on the 18th December, 1781, for a first journey eastwards and in Caffraria. His equipment this time consisted of 30 oxen, 10 for each of his 2 wagons, and 10 as reserve, 3 horses, 9 dogs, and 5 Hottentots. Le Vaillant first crossed the Dutch districts already explored by Spamen, where he met with vast herds of zebras, antelopes, and ostriches, arriving in due course at Zwellendam, where he bought some oxen, a cart, and a cock, the last serving as an alarm clock throughout the journey. Another animal was also of great use to him. This was a monkey he had tamed, and promoted to the post, alike useful and honorable, of taster, no one being allowed to touch any fruit or root unknown to the Hottentots till Master Rees had given his verdict upon it. Till Master Rees had given his verdict. Till Master Rees had given his verdict. Rees was also employed as a sentinel, and his senses, sharpened by use and the struggle for life, exceeded in delicacy those of the most subtle redskin. He it was who warned the dogs of the approach of danger. If a snake approached, or a troop of monkeys were disporting themselves in a neighboring thicket, Rees' terror and his shrieks quickly revealed the presence of a disturbing element. From Zwellendam, which he left on the 12th January, 1782, Le Vaillant made his way eastwards, at some little distance from the sea. He pitched his camp on the banks of the Columbia Diwenhoek River and made many very successful hunting excursions in a district rich in game, finally reaching Mossel Bay, where the howls of innumerable hyenas fright the oxen. A little farther on he entered the country of the Houtniquas, a Hottentot name signifying men filled with honey. Here not a step could be taken without coming upon swarms of bees. Flowers sprang up beneath the feet of the travelers. The air was heavy with their perfume. Their varied colors lent such enchantment to the scene that some of the servants would have liked to halt. Le Vaillant, however, hastened to press on. The whole of this district, down to the sea, is occupied by colonists who breed cattle, make butter, cultivate timber, and collect honey, sending their merchandise to the Cape for sale. A little beyond the last post of the company, Le Vaillant, having entered a district peopled by thousands of turacos and other rare birds, pitched his hunting camp. But his plans were terribly upset by the continuous fall of heavy rains, the result of which was to reduce the travelers to great straits for want of food. After many a sudden change of fortune and many hunting adventures, an account of which would be very amusing, though beyond the scope of our narrative, Le Vaillant reached Mossel Bay. Here, with what delight we can easily imagine, he found letters from France awaiting him. One excursion after another was now made in various directions, until Caffraria was entered. It was difficult to open relations with its people, who sedulously avoided the whites, having suffered the loss of many men and much cattle at their hands. Moreover, the Tambakis had taken advantage of their critical position to invade Caffraria and commit numerous depredations, whilst the Bosjemans hunted them down unmercifully. Without firearms, and attacked on so many sides at once, the Kaffirs were driven to hiding themselves and were retiring northwards. A Kaffir woman. A Kaffir woman. Facsimile of early engraving. As matters stood, it was useless to attempt to penetrate into the mountainous districts of Caffraria, and Le Vaillant retraced his steps. He then visited the Schneeuberg Mountains, the Karoo Desert, and the shores of the Buffalo River, returning to the Cape on the 2nd April, 1783. The results of this long campaign were important. Le Vaillant obtained some decided information about the Gonaquas, a numerous race which must not be confounded with the Hottentots properly so called, but are probably the offspring of their intermarriage with the Kaffirs. With regard to the Hottentots themselves, the information collected by Levaillant agrees on almost every point with that obtained by Spamman. The Kaffirs seen by Levaillant, says Walkner, were most of them taller than either the Hottentots or the Gonaquas. They have neither the retiring jaws nor prominent cheekbones, which are so repulsive in the Hottentots, but are less noticeable in the Gonaquas. Neither have they the broad, flat faces and thick lips of their neighbors, the Negroes of Mozambique. Their faces, on the contrary, are round, their noses fairly prominent, and their teeth the whitest and most regular of any people in the world. Their complexion is of a clear dark brown, and, but for this one characteristic, says Levaillant, any Kaffir woman would be considered very pretty, even beside a European. During Levaillant's 16 months of absence, the aspect of the Cape had completely changed. When the traveler left, he admired the modest bearing of the Dutch women. On his return, he found them thinking only of amusement and dress. Ostrich feathers were so much in vogue that they had to be imported from Europe and Asia. All those brought by our traveler were quickly bought up. The birds which he had sent to the colony on every possible opportunity now amounted to 1,024 specimens, and Mr. Bohr's house, where they were kept, was converted into a regular natural history museum. Levaillant's journey had been so successful that he could not but wish to begin another. Although his friend Boers had returned to Europe, he was able, with the aid of the many other friends he had made, to collect the materials for a fresh trip. On the 15th June, 1783, he started at the head of a caravan numbering 19 persons. He also took 13 dogs, 1 he and 2 she-goats, 3 cows, 36 draft and 14 reserve oxen, with 2 for carrying the baggage of the Hottentot servants. We shall not, of course, follow the traveler in his hunting excursions. All we need to know is that he succeeded in making a collection of marvelous birds, that he introduced the first giraffe to Europe, and that he traversed the whole of the vast space between the Tropic of Capricorn on the west and the 14th meridian on the east. He returned to the Cape in 1784, he embarked for Europe, and arrived at Paris early in January, 1785. The first native people met with by Levaillant in his second voyage were the little Namaquas, a race but very little known, and who soon died out, the more readily that they occupied a barren country, subject to constant attacks from the Bosjemans. Although of fair height, they are inferior in appearance to the Kaffirs and Namaquas, to whose customs theirs bear a great resemblance. The Kamanauquas, or Kamanaquas, of whom Levaillant gives many particulars, exceed them in height. He says, they appear taller even than the Gonaquas, although possibly they are not so in reality, but the illusion is sustained by their small bones, delicate and emaciated appearance, and slender limbs. The long mantle of light material which hangs from the shoulder to the ground adds to their height. They look like drawn-out men. Lighter in color than the Cape natives, they have better features than the other Hottentot tribes, owing to the fact that their noses are less flat and their cheekbones less prominent. Of all the races visited by Levaillant, the most peculiar and most ancient was that of the Huzananas, a tribe which had not been met with by any other northern traveler. But they appear identical with the Bechuanas, although the part of the country assigned to them does not coincide with that which they are known to have occupied for many years. The Huzananas, says the narrative, are small in stature, the tallest being scarcely 5 feet 4 in height. These small beings are perfectly proportioned and are surprisingly strong and active. They have an imposing air of boldness. Levaillant considers them the best endowed mentally and the strongest physically of all the savage races he had met with. In face they resemble the Hottentots, but they have rounder chins and they are far less black. They have curly hair, so short that Levaillant at first imagined it to be shaven. One striking peculiarity of the Huzananas is a large mass of flesh upon the back of the women, which forms a natural saddle and oscillates strangely with every movement of the body. Levaillant describes a woman whom he saw with her child about 3 years old, who was perched upon his feet behind her, like a footman behind a cabriolet. We will pass over the traveler's description of the appearance and customs of these various races, many of which are now extinct or incorporated in some more powerful tribe. Although by no means the least curious portion of his narrative, the details are so exaggerated that we prefer to omit them. Upon the eastern coast of Africa, a Portuguese traveler, named Francisco José de Lacerda y Almeida, left Mozambique in 1797 to explore the interior. The account of this expedition to a place which has only lately been revisited would be of great interest, But unfortunately, so far as we know, his journal has not been published. His name is often quoted by geographers, and they appear to know what countries he visited. But in France, at least, no lengthened notice of this geographer exists which would furnish the details of his exploration. A very few words will convey all that we have been able to collect of the history of a man who made most important discoveries, and whose name has most unfairly been forgotten. Lacerda, the date and place of whose birth are unknown, was an engineer, and he was professionally engaged in settling the boundary of the frontier between the Spanish and Portuguese possessions in South America. Whilst thus employed, he collected a mass of interesting particulars of the province of Mato Grosso, which are given in the Revista Trimensal do Brasil. We cannot tell what circumstances led him, after this successful expedition, to the Portuguese possessions in Africa, nor is it easy to imagine his motive for crossing South Africa from the eastern shore to the Kingdom of Londa. It is, however, certain that he left the well-known town of Tete in 1797 in command of an important caravan bound for the states of Kazumb. This country was governed by a king as renowned for his benevolence and humanity as for his bravery. He inhabited a town called Lunda, which was 2 miles in extent and situated upon the eastern shore of the lake called Mofo. It would have been interesting to compare these localities with those that we know of in the same parallels today, but the lack of details obliges us to desist, merely observing that the word Lunda was well known to Portuguese travelers. As regards Kazumb, there is no longer any question as to its position. Well received by the king, Lacerda remained some 12 days with him, and then proceeded upon his journey. Unfortunately, when a day or two's march from Lunda, he succumbed to fatigue and the unhealthiness of the climate. The native king collected the traveler's notes and journals and ordered them to be sent with his remains to Mozambique. But unfortunately, the caravan entrusted with these precious memorials was attacked, and the remains of the unfortunate Lacerda were left in the heart of Africa. His notes were brought to Europe by a nephew, who had accompanied the expedition. We now come to the account of the expeditions undertaken in the east of Africa, foremost amongst which is that of the well-known traveler Bruce. A Scotchman by birth, like so many other African explorers, James Bruce was brought up for the bar, but the sedentary nature of his occupation had little charm for him, and he embraced an opportunity of entering commercial life. His wife died a few years after their marriage, and Bruce started for Spain, where he employed his leisure in studying Arabic monuments. He wished to publish a detailed account of those in the Escorial, but the Spanish government refused him the necessary permission. Portrait of James Bruce. Portrait of James Bruce. Facsimile of early engraving. Returning to England, Bruce began to study Eastern languages, and more especially the Ethiopian, which at that time was known only through the imperfect works of Ludolf. One day Lord Halifax half-jestingly proposed to him an exploration of the sources of the Nile. Bruce entered enthusiastically into the subject, and set to work to realize it. He overcame every objection, conquered every difficulty, and in June 1768 left England for the shores of the Mediterranean. Bruce hurriedly visited some of the islands of the archipelago, Syria, and Egypt. Leaving Jeddah, he proceeded to Mecca, Labhaya, and arrived at Maswa upon the 19th September, 1769. He had taken care to obtain a firman from the Sultan, and also letters from the Bey of Cairo and the Sheriff of Mecca. This was fortunate, for the Nawab, or governor, did all in his power to prevent his entering Abyssinia, and endeavored to make him pay heavily with presents. Abyssinia had been explored by Portuguese missionaries, thanks to whose zeal some information about the country had been obtained, although far less accurate in detail than that which we owe to Bruce. Although his veracity has often been questioned, succeeding travelers have confirmed his assertions. From Maswa to Adowa the road rises gradually, and passes over the mountains which separate Tigray from the shores of the Red Sea. Adowa was not originally the capital of Tigray. A manufacture of a coarse cotton cloth, which circulates as current money in Abyssinia, was established there. The soil in the neighborhood is deep enough for the cultivation of corn. In these districts, says Bruce, there are 3 harvests a year. The first seeds are sown in July and August when the rain flows abundantly. In the same season they sow takaso, teff, and barley. About the 20th of November they reap the first barley, then the wheat, and last of all the teff. In some of these they sow immediately upon the same ground without any manure, barley, which they reap in February, and then often sow teff, but more frequently a kind of vetch or pea called shimbra. These are cut down before the first rains, which are in April, Yet with all the advantages of a triple harvest, which requires neither manure nor any expensive processes, the farmer in Abyssinia is always very poor. At Fremona, not far from Adoa, are the ruins of a Jesuit convent, resembling rather a fort than the abode of men of peace. 2 days' journey further on, one comes to the ruins of Axum, the ancient capital of Abyssinia. In one square, says Bruce, which I apprehend to have been the center of the town, there are 40 obelisks, none of which have any hieroglyphics on them. The two first have fallen down, but a third a little smaller than them is still standing. They are all hewn from one block of granite, and on the top of that which is standing there is a patera, exceedingly well engraved in the Greek style. After passing the convent of Abba Pantelon, called in Abyssinia Mantillas, and the small obelisk on a rock above, we follow a path cut in a mountain of very red marble, having on the left a marble wall forming a parapet about 5 feet high. At intervals, solid pedestals rise from this wall, bearing every token of having served to support colossal statues of Sirius, the barking Anubis, or the dog Star. 133 of these pedestals with the marks just mentioned are still in their places, but only 2 figures of the dog were recognizable when I was there. These, however, though much mutilated, were evidently Egyptian. There are also pedestals supporting the figures of the Sphinx. 2 magnificent flights of steps, several 100 feet long, all of granite, exceedingly well finished, and still in their places, are the only remains of a magnificent temple. In an angle of this platform where the temple stood is the present small church of Axum. This church is a mean, small building, very ill kept and full of pigeons' dung. It was near Axum that Bruce saw 3 soldiers cut from a living cow a steak for their midday meal. In his account of their method of cutting the steak, Bruce says, the skin which had covered the flesh that was cut away was left intact, and was fastened to the corresponding part by little wooden skewers serving as pins. Whether they put anything between the skin and the wounded flesh I do not know, but they soon covered the wound with mud. They then forced the animal to rise and drove it on before them, to furnish them, no doubt, with another meal when they should join their companions in the evening. From Tigray, Bruce passed into the province of Syre, which derives its name from its capital, a town considerably larger than Axum, but constantly a prey to putrid fevers. Near it flows the Takas, the ancient Ceres, with its poisonous waters bordered by majestic trees. In the province of Saman, situated amongst the unhealthy and broiling Waldubba Mountains, and where many monks had retired to pray and do penance, Bruce stayed only long enough to rest his beasts of burden, for the country was not only haunted by lions and hyenas, and infested by large black ants which destroyed part of his baggage, but also torn with civil war, so that foreigners were anything but safe. This made him most anxious to reach Gondar, but when he arrived, typhoid fever was raging fiercely. His knowledge of medicine was very useful to him, and procured him a situation under the governor, which was most advantageous to him, as it rendered him free to scour the country in all directions, at the head of a body of soldiers. By these means he acquired a mass of valuable information upon the government, manners, and customs of the country, and the chief events of its history, which combined to make his work the most important hitherto published about Abyssinia. It was in the course of one of these excursions that Bruce discovered the sources of the Blue Nile, which he took to be the true Nile. Arrived at the church of St. Michael at Gish, where the river is only 4 paces wide and some 4 inches deep, Bruce became convinced that its sources must be in the neighborhood, although his guide assured him that he must cross a mountain before he found them. The traveler was not to be deceived. Come, come, said Bruce, no more words. It is already late, lead me to Gish and the sources of the Nile, and show me the mountain that separates us from it. He then made me go round to the south of the church, and coming out of the grove of cedars surrounding it, this is the mountain, he said, looking maliciously up into my face, that when you were on the other side of it was between you and the fountains of the Nile. There is no other. Look at that green hillock in the center of that marsh. It is there that the 2 fountains of the Nile are to be found. Gish is at the top of the rock, where you see those very green trees. If you go to the fountains, pull off your shoes as you did the other day, for these people are all pagans, and they believe in nothing that you believe, but only in the Nile, to which they pray every day as if it were God, as you perhaps invoke it yourself. I took off my shoes and rushed down the hill towards the little green island, which was about 200 yards distant. The whole of the side of the hill was carpeted with flowers, the large roots of which protruded above the surface of the ground. And as I was looking down, and noticing that the skin was peeling off the bulbs, I had 2 very severe falls before I reached the edge of the marsh. But at last I approached the island with its green sod. It was in the form of an altar, and apparently of artificial construction. I was in rapture as I gazed upon the principal fountain, which rises in the middle of it. It is easier to imagine than to describe what I felt at that moment, standing opposite the sources which had baffled the genius and courage of the most celebrated men for 3,000 years. Bruce's narrative contains many other curious observations, but we must now pass on to his account of Lake Tizana. Lake Tizana, according to his narrative, is by far the largest sheet of water known in these regions. Its extent, however, has been greatly exaggerated. Its greatest breadth from Dinglebur to Lamg, i.e., from east to west, is 35 miles, but it decreases greatly at each end, and in some parts is not above 10 miles broad. Its greatest length is 49 miles from north to south, measured from Bab Baha to a point a trifle to the SW14W. Of the spot where the Nile, after flowing through the lake with an ever-perceptible current, bends towards Dara in the Alata territory. In the dry season, from October to March, the lake decreases greatly. But when the rains have swollen the rivers, which unite at this place like the spokes of a wheel at the nave, the lake rises and overflows a portion of the plain. If the Abyssinians, great liars at all times, are to be believed, there are 45 islands in Lake Tizana, but this number may be safely reduced to 11. The largest is named Dek, Daka, or Daga. The next in size are Halamun, on the Gondar side of the lake, Brigida on the Gorgora side, and Galila beyond Brigida. All these islands were formerly used as prisons for Abyssinian chieftains, or as retreats by such as were dissatisfied at court, or wished to secure their valuables in troubled times. And now, having visited Abyssinia with Bruce, let us return to the north. Some light was now being thrown upon the ancient civilization of Egypt. The archaeological expedition of Pakak, Norden, Niebuhr, Volney, and Savary had been published in succession, and the Egyptian Society was at work upon the publication of its large and magnificent work. The number of travelers increased daily, and amongst others W. G. Brown determined to visit the land of the pharaohs. From his work we learn much alike of the monuments and ruins which make this country so interesting, and of the customs of its inhabitants. The portion of the work relating to Darfur is entirely new, no Europeans having previously explored it. Brown attained a high place among travelers by his discovery that the Bahr el Abiad is the true Nile, and because he endeavored not indeed to discover its source, that he could scarcely hope to do, but to ascertain its latitude and course. Arriving in Egypt upon the 10th of January, 1792, Brown set out upon his first expedition to Siwa, and discovered, as Horneman did later, the oasis of Jupiter Ammon. He had little more opportunity than his successor for exploring the catacombs and ruins, where he saw many skulls and human remains.